My name is Aidan Beatty. I'm a historian from Ireland originally, and I now teach at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh.
Well, thank you for joining the discussion today. And we're going to be talking about your article, The Pornography of Fools, Tracing the History of Sexual Antisemitism. So if you could begin by kind of giving us an outline of how you came to this subject, what caused you to be interested in it, and what you may have discovered while writing it.
Sure. I'm a historian mainly focusing on Irish history, and then one of the things I've been interested in for quite a while is Irish Jewish history. And usually what that means for me is ways in which Irish history compares or contrasts with Jewish history. And by virtue of that, I've just ended up doing a fair amount of work or just a fair amount of reading on the actual history of Jews in Ireland, which is a pretty small field for history, and it's a small community in terms of the Jewish community in Ireland. At its height, it's about 4,000 people at the very end of World War II. And if we compare it to other areas, other like national Jewish histories, right, German Jewish history or Polish Jewish history or wherever, it's also fairly tame. You don't get a lot of the really extreme violence that you see in places like Nazi Germany or Romania between World War I and World War II. Um, but there is this one moment in the early 20th century where, in a city called Limerick, which is a provincial city on the west coast of Ireland, there is a campaign to basically that eventually leads to the small Jewish community being expelled from the city. And it starts when local traders basically gang together with a local priest, and the traders encourage the priest to start giving sermons to denounce Jews and the presence of Jews in the city. The traders are really hostile to Jews because these newly arrived Jewish immigrants are selling on credit and they're undermining their business. And the priest, this Catholic priest, John Cray, is very hostile to Jews for very classically Catholic anti-Semitic reasons. And this is just after the Dreyfus affair in France. And Cray is a member of the Redemptorist Order, which is a Catholic order of priests that had been essentially pushed out of France following the Dreyfus affair. So he has these very religious motivations. Um, and generally speaking, when people write about anti-Semitism, those are the two things they'll often talk about, either some kind of economic anxiety or economic hostility towards Jews. And my title is a play on a famous phrase that's often ascribed to a European Marxist called August Bebel, where he said that anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools, that there's you have some kind of recognition of class consciousness, but then it misfires into anti-Semitism rather than into socialism, into proper socialism. Um, or you have some kind of religious hostility towards Jews. And I've been aware of this incident since I was an undergraduate in college. And there's one moment in one of his sermons where Cray um, makes this comment about Irish Catholic women buying things on credit from Jewish men, from Jewish male traders, and that if you went to the homes of those traders late at night, you would see these women, he says, like pouring into this house of this one particular Jewish trader to pay him back the money he owes him, but that they don't have the money. And it always seemed to me that what he was suggesting was that essentially the Irish Catholic women were being forced into having sex with this Jewish man. His language is very careful and guarded because he is in a quite conservative society, so you can't just come out and say things. And yet no one ever seemed to have picked up on that. And there's a fair amount of literature on this moment because it's one of the most overt moments of anti-Semitism in 20th century Irish history. And I think as often happens with me and maybe happens with other people, like that little kind of recognition that there was something else there that people hadn't noticed. It just kind of lived at the back of my head for quite a while. And I sort of just thought about it more and more. And then um, in about 2019, 2020, I thought I'm going to do something more about that. And I'm going to like investigate it a little bit more. And so I started reading other things about basically what I call in the title sexual anti-Semitism. Like, is there a sexual component to anti-Jewish hatred? And a lot of people, it seemed, had like recognized specific moments where this happened, but no one had ever written a big kind of macro level theoretical essay um, about this being a recurring theme across the entire history of anti-Semitism, going back to the Middle Ages or even earlier. So I just sort of set out to do that myself, I guess, and started reading a whole load of things in a whole load of different national contexts about anti-Jewish violence and anti-Jewish imagery, and found that again and again it has this oddly sexual connotation to it.
Well, and yeah, one of the conclusions you come to, which I'd kind of like to focus on, is that there's a sexual component to the anti-Semitism and even racism in the States and in Nazi Germany and all across the different cultures when you have anti-Semitism. But there's also the racist tropes of the super sexual predator of the black male and the overly sexed black female and how those determine those bodies as well. But one of the things you touch on, and I think it's a really astute observation, is that this bigotry and racism creates its own sense of arousal, titillation, humiliation, and creates an environment in which the person who's an anti-Semite is enjoying the anti-Semitism.
Hmm.
I think that answers or puts another piece in the puzzle as to how people can be radicalized to these basically irrational hate systems. So
Hmm.
talk a little bit about that, and then we can get into some of the ways it manifests.
Sure. So, as I say in the paper, there's a kind of a fundamental mismatch here. Um, the vast majority, if not everyone who studies anti-Semitism in a serious way, is not anti-Semitic and sees it as something horrific and horrible. And I began to think as I was doing this project that we missed then the fact that for people who are actually invested in this, who are anti-Semitic and who genuinely believe in this, it's not disgusting and horrible. It's actually something that they strongly support, they strongly believe in, and maybe pushing it a little bit further, then I argue that they actually get pleasure from this. That it's the pleasure of hatred, the pleasure you get from inflicting pain on others, the pleasure you get from imagining others getting their due comeuppance and things like that. And I think what was quite valuable for me was to think about this comparatively in terms of other forms of hatred, because people who study other forms of racism and bigotry do recognize this. I think that there's a pleasure that people get from racist violence. Um, so there's a very well established thing about a very well established set of tropes about black people that are hypersexualized, that either seeing black men as both sexually dangerous, but also in some ways kind of sexually exciting. And seeing black women as just receptacles for the sexual attentions of white men. And then I was also really interested in a book called Empire's Endgame it's actually written by about 8 or 10 collective, 8 or 10 people working collectively. And it's a book about racism and politics in Britain. And it talks a little bit about a kind of essentially a racist conspiracy theory that exists in Britain in the last few years that claims that particularly Pakistani men are involved in gangs that are grooming women, grooming white women, almost always, and forcing them into some kind of sex slavery or sexual labor of some kind. Um, and what the authors of this book, Gargi Bhattacharya and a number of the people that she's working with, is this collective. They notice that there's always just too much detail in the descriptions of these grooming gangs, more than you actually need to make the racist point. And actually the point starts to be obvious that the point is also sexual. It's about kind of getting away with a kind of pornography, getting away with sexual titillation by claiming that you're just discussing something racist. Um, and there's often a kind of a jealousy that seems to be all kind of bubbling up to the surface here, claiming that Pakistani men are able to get away with things that white men are not able to get away with, and then in some ways wishing that you could do what they do if only you can replace them and push them out. And I think there are similar but slightly different things that go on in anti-Semitism too about jealousy, about sexual desire, that are also bound up with hatred and violence.
Yeah, and I think that you mentioned the use of the word cuckold or cuck and how it's become very pronounced in alt-right and
Hmm.
men's rights groups, the manosphere, as it were, of today. And can we talk a little bit about what that demasculization and humiliation ultimately, it's a double-edged coin, right? And this
Hmm.
kind of what you're talking about with this. They're getting away with something that nor like to the white supremacists, white people can't get
Hmm.
right.
So a long time ago, maybe not a long time ago, I guess about 8 years ago or so, I read a book called The Heart of Whiteness by a writer called Julian Carter, who makes the point that we have to understand that white supremacy is not just about perceived strength, but it's also this kind of complicated, complicated counterintuitive way. It's also about a sense of perceived weakness, that something has gone wrong. But then there's a strength that you find to fix the problem, and only you, as a proper white person, would have been able to engage in that. And that's another one of these sort of things that has just kind of lived in my head for quite a while. I've always just thought that was a really fascinating way to think about race. That it has these internal contradictions to it. Um, and then as someone who has, in different times and places has been teaching in gender studies programs, there's a book that I've often kind of enjoyed using in my classes called Not Gay: Sex Between Straight White Men. Um, because it always gets, if I have a classroom of 30 people, 29 of them will say like this is nonsense, right? And it's a book about men who have sex with other men, but then will say that they're not gay. So they're heterosexual men who have homosexual sex. Um, and there's always one student who's saying, "No, I get this. Like this is fascinating," and that's usually like the best student in the class. Um, and Jane Ward, the author of that book, has this discussion about a particular genre of pornography that is very much about this word cuckold. It's um, a a pornographic genre where what usually happens in the kind of set plots of this genre is a white man who's married to a white woman is forced to watch as his wife has sex with a black man. Um, and there's sort of elements of this that are just about titillation, as you would expect in pornography. Um, but as Andrea Long Chu points out in another discussion of this genre of pornography, this is all a fantasy, right? So you could fantasize. I mean, you can fantasize anything. There's no limits to what you can fantasize. So why are you choosing to fantasize this? Why are you choosing to fantasize your own humiliation? Um, and people like Andrea Long Chu and Jane Ward that have written about this have said that it's a similar example of like whiteness as weakness, of saying, I'm weak now, but if I can replace this person, I will get their strength. Um, so that's in a way like that's the genre of pornography that the word cuckold or that causes this medieval word to re-enter into our lexicon, and then it has been adopted by very hard right people as a way to describe either the supposed humiliation of having um, so-called conservatives who are not properly conservative, right? That they're cuck-servatives in their lingo, or it has become instead like also a kind of a very aggressive verb about like such and such a political leader has cucked someone because he has humiliated them, and we as his followers can kind of gain satisfaction and pleasure from seeing how he humiliates our enemies in ways that are actually very similar to the genre of pornography that they're taking this from.
Yeah, and that's, yeah, thank you, because that kind of explains that terminology today, and people probably have heard, the cuck and not understood what it really infers. And I was, because I'm a fan of Zizek, I was
Hmm.
to see you mention him here, and his, um, I mean, you can only be a fan of Zizek so far, but but his take on pornography and how you tie it to the racist project and white supremacy.
Hmm.
Interesting. So could you explain kind of his point and what you get out of it?
Yeah, I would say I kind of I want to be a fan of Zizek, and I don't know if I have the patience for reading him. And he has this tendency of kind of going off in about 10 different directions at once, even on the printed page. But that's that the little kind of piece I take from him is from a film that he featured in called The Pervert's Guide to Cinema, where he said that pornography is a deeply conservative genre because it's never about trying to confound your beliefs or challenge your beliefs. It's about flattering them and flattering your desires and flattering what you want rather than trying to get you to want something new or different. Um, and so one of the kind of things I got people to say as I was going through the process of having this paper accepted in an academic journal, I got some pushback from people about, I'm making these claims about like people have a desire and we can see that desire playing out in terms of, quite ugly racist propaganda and also just in terms of pornography itself. Um, And of course, there's a limit to how much I can genuinely empirically know about people, as there is no matter what kind of source material you're using. But then, if you're studying very extreme people who, for legal reasons, are not going to write down their deepest desires and so on, there are even more limits as to what you can truly know. But my sort of answer to that, or the ways that I've at least hopefully tightened up what I argue in the paper, is that if we see the same tropes emerging again and again, and people essentially engaging in the same fantasies again and again, it's reasonable to think that there's something going on here, that there's some kind of recurring anxiety or recurring desire, whether that's a desire to have a particular kind of male body, or a desire to see certain kinds of people be humiliated, or to kind of get revenge over certain racial groups and things like that. Whether or not people want to believe that or whether they're willing to go as far with me as that, I'm happy to have anyone criticize me for that.
Well, it made a lot of sense to me in the sense that so much of the racist project is a characterization of reality. And in order to justify the hateful ideology and the hateful thinking of the racist, they come up with these grotesque characters. And they're always, you know, accentuating physical things more than anything else. And there's this tie to kind of a hypersexuality to all of those characterizations,
Hmm.
and I think that those images can be viewed then as pornographic, as you showed
Hmm.
in the piece with the Nazi propaganda.
Hmm.
So let's talk a little bit about some of those characterizations and what purposes you think they serve, starting
Hmm.
with the anti-Black definitions.
Well, I would say, first of all, and maybe this is kind of a roundabout way to answer your question, um, all forms of racism is inherently sexual, or at least American style anti-black racism is definitely inherently sexual because it seeks to make a number of claims about biology and about the biological origins of people. And you can't talk about people's biological origins without talking about sexual reproduction. Um, so there's a very long history, which scholars like Jane Daly have noted, that even right after the Civil War and right in the era of Reconstruction, you start to see claims about black men desiring white women, which is then used as a legitimation for attacking black men and for kind of redrawing a boundary between white people and black people. It's essentially it's one of, but not certainly not the only way, but one of the ways that you create segregation is by really reinforcing um, a geographical boundary that's also a political boundary that's also a sexual boundary. That black people and white people are not to interact, certainly not to interact in white ways. Sorry, in sexual ways. Um, and also then it allows you to prevent the problem of racial mixing, of people being of mixed race, which um, the kind of the taxonomy of racism can't really abide. It's, racists are okay with the fact that there are black people and white people. It just doesn't want there to ever be people who are both black and white. I mean, that's one thing that racists want. They want many things. Um, so I think that that kind of anti-black sexual imagery is coming out of very specific moments in American history after the Civil War, and in that particularly as you move out of Reconstruction and into the Jim Crow era, that's when you start to see a lot of that imagery becoming like not just existing, but actually becoming a widespread way of thinking about Black people. And it kind of continues that way into the 20th century.
Yeah, and I mean, racist violence is almost always predicated on some sort of accusation of rape or
Hmm.
sexual impropriety. I mean, even Emmett Till, who was a child, supposedly made an advance to a white woman that ended up in his murder. So it's, I think that's it's undisputable.
Yeah.
So how does that then, when we think about anti-Semitism, we don't think of the anti-Semite as instilling the same sort of grotesque sexual landscape overcoding.
Hmm.
There's more of, as you said, this economic or like secretive control of society, and it isn't as sexualized in our popular understanding of what
Hmm.
anti-Semitism is. So how do you tie that together?
Sure. So one of the really thorny problems you have to deal with when you write about anti-Semitism is do we just assume that this is an age-old hatred? And there's a number of books that have been written about anti-Semitism that use the phrase "the longest hatred." Um, and as I often will tell my students, this is just not true, right? It's not the longest hatred because misogyny is way older. Um, and then there's also the problem of it is always a thing that is changing over time, as does any ideology. And I do think of anti-Semitism as a kind of ideology and a way of organizing the world inside your own head. Um, so if we look in the Middle Ages, and scholars of anti-Semitism will usually draw a distinction between anti-Semitism, which they see as modern, and trying to draw on the same kind of claims about biological race that say anti-black racism in the US does. If we In contrast to that, we have something called anti-Judaism, a religious suspicion or religious hatred of Jews. Um, and there can be some really shocking things you come across when you read accounts in medieval chronicles and in um, kind of moral tales and things like that were written down in the Middle Ages. When they talk about Jews, they talk about them often in incredibly sexual ways. Often it's about claims that there are Jewish seductresses that will lure monks away from monasteries and away from Christianity, or claims that Jewish men are somehow sexually monstrous. Um, that they claims that Jewish men can menstruate, that they copulate with pigs, um, and these are often much more. I mean, these kind of accusations are much more religious at root, even though they're using this hypersexual language. So the actual rate at which monks are having sex with Jewish women is practically zero. So these are not real stories, and as a lot of medieval scholars would say, they're much more about drawing a boundary between Jews and Christians and really reinforcing Christian orthodoxy as opposed to Jewish apostasy. Um, a lot of the claims that are made about Jews, whether it's things like I mentioned, like the Judensau, the claim that Jews and pigs have sex with each other, or even claims like the blood libel, the claim that Jewish people again, Jewish men usually in depictions of it, kill children and take their blood and use the blood to make matzah. As a scholar called Israel Jacob Yuval has pointed out, these are often, if you read them a little bit against the grain, it's clear that the people making these accusations actually know something about Judaism. There are, of course, there's no evidence whatsoever that any Jewish person has ever killed a Christian child to use their blood. But there are Jewish people who kill animals and slit their throat so the blood drains out. That's what kosher butchery does. And when we look at the ways that blood libels are often depicted, it, it it is reasonable to think that actually these are kind of very vicious satires of kosher butchery. Um, the claim that the Jewish men have sex with pigs, which is a very, very common thing made in the Middle Ages. At Martin Luther's church in Wittenberg in Germany, there is to this day, an image of a Judensau carved into the front of the church. Um, that's clearly drawing on an awareness of Jewish dietary law, right? So rather than recognizing that Jewish people don't eat pork because that's what the book of Leviticus tells them not to do, you invert that into a vicious accusation that they're actually hypocrites who secretly not just like pork, but actually are having sex with pigs. So this is what humor looks like in the Middle Ages. This is medieval vicious religious satire. Now it's nasty and it's awful, but it's probably doing something as a form of entertainment. It's probably working as a form of entertainment and also a form of very crude religious instruction. Um, the and as I kind of go on to do in the paper, then we can trace this use of sexual imagery right up to the modern age in terms of how at least anti-Semitic people think about Jews.
Well, and it also plays into that pornographic permission. So
Hmm.
if you have an image of bestiality, you're actually showing bestiality regardless of what the
Hmm.
anti-Semitism is, and there's a kind of delayed gratification there as well, correct?
Yeah, I mean, there's a concept in rhetoric called occupatio, where you say the thing you claim you're not allowed to say. I would never say, John, that like that shirt is really awful and it doesn't suit you. Like I'm a nice person, I would never say that, but a mean person would say that, right? And I think this stuff kind of functions the same way, right? You're making claims that Jews are sexually deviant, sexually dangerous, but in so doing, you are constantly like you're giving way too much detail for this. And at a certain point, I think it's worth questioning, like, why are they actually doing this? Is this about Jews or is it about their own sexual desires? There's a thing that uh, in the book, The Paranoid Style of American Politics, the author's name I'm blanking on right now.
Hofstadter, I think.
Hofstadter, Richard Hofstadter. So he says I mean, again, this is one of those kind of comparative things that sort of just really helped me frame what I was trying to do here. He looks at anti-Catholic propaganda in the 19th century, and particularly a story called The Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk, which is a very famous, at least in the 1840s, 1850s, it's a very popular book in America. And it's an account of a nun in a convent in Montreal who has been basically turned into a sex slave for priests. It's very, very graphic, very shocking to read. It's a complete and utter hoax. Um, and Hofstadter says that anti-Catholicism is the pornography of the Puritan, which I mean is a really wonderful way of describing this. But if you're a Puritan, you're not supposed to want to engage in pornography. But if what you claim you're doing is being anti-Catholic, you can get away with a lot of things then.
Right. And then it goes back to that they're getting away with the thing we're not allowed to do. So let's
Yeah.
talk about it because we can't do it.
Bec
Right.
yeah. And because we secretly really wish we could do that. Yeah.
So let's get into more modern and awful
Hmm.
history where anti-Semitism led to the Nazi project and the
Hmm.
Nazi Holocaust. And what did you find when you started looking at some of the youth magazines for
Hmm.
during the Nazi period? Because some of those images turned out to be pretty shocking and
Hmm.
salient to your point.
Yeah, so this is where, I mean, there has been quite a lot of research on this. There's a historian called Dagmar Herzog who has a book called Sex After Fascism, which in some of the early chapters, she talks about those kind of magazines, which are kind of lowbrow magazines aimed at a popular audience that um, are essentially like selling Nazism to German people, and they exist, before 1933, and then they have a kind of the imprimatur of the German state after 1933. So the one I look at particularly is a quite notorious magazine called Der Stürmer, which is not actually officially allied to the Nazi Party, but everyone in Germany recognizes at the time like this is a very much a pro-Nazi publication. And primarily what I looked at in that were cartoons that in some way or other have sexual content to them. So usually they're depicting a German woman um, who is at some way being targeted sexually by a Jewish man, or by a number of Jewish men. And again, you find the same thing of like you don't need the sexual content to make the anti-Semitic claim. Um, so to me, the sexual content is probably doing something there. And Herzog points out in her discussion of this, like there's no, it's hard to know, did people look at this uh, and take anti-Semitic messages from it, or do they just look at it as a form of sexual titillation? Um, but usually you have images of like a prone German Gentile Aryan woman, and then some kind of like leering, rapacious Jewish man who is preying upon her sexually or has actually gotten access to her sexually. Um, and what seems to be going on to me is that a number of different senses of national weakness and economic weakness are then being kind of mapped onto to some claim of sexual weakness, or sexual impotence, and that this is all depicting the wrong state of affairs from the perspective of Der Stürmer and of people who are kind of allied to it ideologically, that there should be a Germany where only German men get access to German women, not Jewish men, like German Gentile men, Aryan men. Um, and as I say in the paper, right, it's not really clear if these cartoons are opposed to the idea of German women being raped. It's that they're opposed to them being raped by Jewish men. And there's one particular cartoon then that I include in the paper, um, which in translated into English, the title of the cartoon is No Entry for Jews. And then in the subtitle, it says, It is really wonderful that today in Germany, one can be among their own again. And it depicts a very stereotypically Aryan German man reclining next to a pool with a German woman, wearing swim costumes. Um, and what it seems to be depicting to me is, I mean, this is after the passage of the Nuremberg laws, so after Jews start to be really systemically barred from public life in Germany. It's depicting a new life of sexual ease that German Aryan men get now that they live in a Germany where Jews are being pushed out, and in a sense, Jews are being barred from having sexual contact with German women. I would also say, and maybe kind of connecting this back to American anti-black racism, it's probably not a coincidence that it's depicting a swimming pool because those are often places, as also happens um, in American anti-black racism. Those are places where young people interact, they mix. They are kind of in a somewhat innocent way. They're sites of sexual contact, and so there's a very long history of racially segregated swimming pools, and in this case, making sure that places like swimming pools are completely free of Jews and are for Aryans only.
Well, and it ties that idea of the white male or the racist male having been denied something and having to overcome
Hmm.
obstacle to get access to it again. In this case, it would be female
Yeah.
female attention and sexual activity, which is, it is so complicated that it answers all the things we were just talking about.
Hmm.
So let's jump ahead now to the Great Replacement theory, which
Hmm.
is very much a piece and parcel of what's going on
Hmm.
in today's society. But um, you begin with recounting a rumor
Yeah.
of a castrated, murdered boy, and then
Hmm.
depending on what age of fear and hatred is prevalent, it can be any group, Jewish,
Hmm.
Black, Latino, whatever.
Yeah. So this is a rumor that I came across in a book called Set the Night on Fire, by John Weiner and Mike Davis. And Mike Davis is pretty well known, a very great historian of Los Angeles. And it's a book about Los Angeles in the 1960s. And this is in the book, they recount this rumor that spreads in California in the summer of 1964. So this is just leading up to the Goldwater Johnson presidential election. And as often happens with these kind of like urban myths, everyone kind of recounting this tale will say, well, I know someone who can verify that this actually happened. And supposedly what had happened, according to the rumor, is that a group of adult black men had basically kidnapped a 3-year-old white boy in a public bathroom and then had castrated him. So I mean, very, very shocking and very graphic. And then there are different versions of the rumor that circulate in more Hispanic neighborhoods, or I would say in white neighborhoods adjacent to Hispanic neighborhoods in Los Angeles, where the assailants are supposed to be Mexican or supposed to be Hispanic, of some kind of Hispanic group. Um, and then a journalist called Paul Coates, who worked at the time for the Los Angeles Times, he began to receive letters from different readers who said that they had heard the exact same story um, growing up in Germany in the 1930s. But then the little white boy, like the 3-year-old white boy, was actually a German Aryan boy. And instead of it claiming that these were black or Hispanic assailants, the assailants were supposed to be Jewish. Um, so on the one hand, what you have is what looks a lot actually like a blood libel tale, but then it has kind of essentially been exported to the United States and it has kind of taken on a new form and been rewritten to fit within American racism. Um, and the Great Replacement theory to me has a similar kind of, you can trace a similar origin for it. Already in Mein Kampf, you can find Hitler making claims about Jews importing black people with the desire of replacing white Germans, essentially. And that's essentially, I mean, for people who don't know what that conspiracy theory is, it is a claim that some kind of shadowy group of people are importing non-white people so as to replace the native-born white population. And as usually happens when you look at these kinds of stories, right, you have non-white people who are kind of the simple-minded tools of some other group of people who are themselves seen as nefarious, utterly crafty, and very devious and hell-bent on the destruction of mainstream white society. And in the kind of racist imagination, there's only one group of people that fits that bill, which is Jews, right? So it's both very, very anti-black or anti-non-white, as well as being very anti-Semitic. And so this story has kind of, when I first started this project, even in like 2019, 2020, it was still the case that this was very much more of a fringe idea. And it has continued to move more into the mainstream, and you find relatively mainstream politicians now making these claims. Sometimes they're a bit careful to couch this in seemingly race blind language, but it's still, with a little bit of poking, you can still see the anti-black and anti-Jewish aspects of all this. And what I kind of I end the paper by talking about this, um, partly just because this is the most contemporary manifestation of this much longer set of phenomena that I've been trying to trace. Um, but one of the things I tried to to argue is that we almost need to look at what this great replacement theory is promising into the future. Not just that this can be undone, but that when the supposed conspiracy is unmasked and dismantled and stopped, um, that you will now have no longer non-white men looking to have sex with white women. You will have white women essentially forced to have sex with white men. White men will be they will get to return to their rightful place as the true sexual possessors of white women. I think I talk about it as being a kind of Doctor Strangelove type fantasy about um, in this future you will again have the ability to have sexual access because you will have to repopulate a previously decimated or a previously weakened white race. And I would argue that this is drawing on like a much longer set of ideas about Jews, about Black people, and about sex, essentially.
Yeah, and we saw some of the anti-Jewish um, ties to bringing people in during the civil rights movement, because there was that whole movement, the whole idea that somehow the civil rights movement was Jewish funded,
Hmm.
Jewish organized in order to speed up this replacement or this downfall of
Hmm.
the race, right?
Yeah, so this is something I came across actually in Ohio, in the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati. One of the basic problems you face if you want to study neo-Nazis and genuinely extreme people is where do you actually get access to their materials? And for a number of complicated reasons, the American Jewish Archives has a really like large collection of neo-Nazi material. Um, And so I mean, this was something I came across quite a lot that in either like overtly anti-black organizations in the 1950s, 1960s, or in segregationist organizations, states' rights type organizations, um, this claim comes up again and again that the civil rights movement is actually a Jewish conspiracy. Um, and I think this is a kind of there's a way in which the civil rights movement actually can't really be explained by racists because how do you explain the fact that Martin Luther King is so effective, is able to build a mass movement, is able to unite people? Well, if you're not a racist, you explain why he was a really good organizer and was really smart and he knew how politics works. Those are things you don't want to have to admit if you're an anti-black racist. You don't want to have to admit that actually Martin Luther King is a brilliant person. You need this other force that will explain it. You need some kind of like Deus ex machina that can explain why this is happening. So you need again, some group of people that are nefarious, very smart, but utterly evil. And as always happens, I think the only group of people that they will glom on to are Jews.
So I think one point before we kind of wrap this up is the I was surprised by how little female participation in this
Hmm.
there seems to be. It seems that it's always male centered, and it's always the fear is always male,
Hmm.
and the sexual attack of women. Did you find anything that would complicate or make
Hmm.
complicit some of the white racist women in telling this story?
Well, the sort of in terms of say anti-black racism and the kind of the imagery that is or the, sort of the image that's being offered to you of what America can become like if this racist revolution can happen, um, the place that women will get in that is generally going to be quite conservative and traditionalist. There are a lot of women who join far-right groups and can kind of carve out positions for themselves, but they have to do it knowing um, their their rights will be circumscribed, both in the present and into any potential future that they can build together. Um, Maybe this goes back to what I said earlier about racism always being inherently biological and sexual in the claims it makes about the world, but um, the anxieties that are really bubbling up to the surface in this are very much male anxieties. You can see very similar things in anti-Semitism, where even going back to the Middle Ages and to more religious anti-Judaism, there are, there's a very rich body of things like woodcuts and folk art and things like that from the Middle Ages that is very, very anti-Jewish, but it's almost always depicting Jewish men. And I think it's partly to do with a fear that or a sense that Jewish men are the truly dangerous ones, whereas Jewish women are more likely to be convertible to Christianity. Um, there's a very odd history, which I kind of gesture towards a little bit in the book, in the paper, but don't talk about all that much about the ways in which Jewish women have been depicted in kind of sexualized ways, but not dangerous in the same way as Jewish men are. Um, so there are other histories going on here, but I don't really do anything other than just kind of note them in passing, rather than incorporating them into the paper itself.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that was just one of the things I was thinking about as I read it. And then I'd like to finish kind of by reiterating what I think is an important point of the paper, which is that this state of hate
Hmm.
somehow pornographic in what it gives to the hater. So
Hmm.
white supremacist, the anti-Semite, these people are getting some satisfaction from
Hmm.
all of this, and it's pornographic in your take. So would you kind of just bring us home on that point and then
I mean, the maybe going back to what I said earlier of like the thorny problem of studying anti-Semitism is why does it keep emerging again and again? Um, and at one point, I think you said something about like this is the nature of irrational hatred. And I want to be very careful what I'm saying here, but there are certain ways in which anti-black racism has a very crude rationality to it. I think one of my favorite books about race in modern America is Keangi Yamahata Taylor's book, Race for Profit, about housing in America. And she looks at one point at a particular incident in Michigan, and I think it was in the city of Davison, which is a suburb of Flint. So it's a suburb that basically people that are in the 1950s, 1960s that are kind of rising up economically by working at car plants in Flint, they move to Davison and they buy houses there. And those houses are the one asset they're ever going to probably own in their life. So that's their one source of like financial security. And then you get, as happens in a lot of Midwestern cities, coming into the 60s and into the 70s and 80s, you get uh, black people also moving into those neighborhoods. And you get a white backlash against them. And it would be very easy to just say, well, these people are just racists, and I mean, in some cases they just are, right? That's not totally inaccurate. But Taylor then says you have to understand the ways in which racism is actually kind of trapping these people. That this is their house is their one asset. They need to maintain the value of it, and they know that if black people move into their neighborhood, um, their house price will drop. And that's I think what she means by saying like they're trapped into this into racism. Like racism is actually that's part of like the insidiousness of racism that it pulls people in and makes them complicit. Um, and so when you study anti-black racism, like that can those kind of like very crude rationalities are always there in terms of like knowing that you will be treated differently by the police if you are white versus if you're black, knowing that your home will be worth more if you're white than if you're black. And when you then study anti-Jewish bigotry, it can be very hard to know like what's actually rational about this. And there's no rationality. I remember years ago teaching a European history class where I had students read a passage from Mein Kampf. And Hitler starts talking about he's talking about his early life in pre-World War One Vienna, and he's working on building sites, and like he starts to realize, at least according to his own narrative, like Jews are everywhere and they're controlling the media and they're controlling people's minds. Um, and so I started the class and I was saying, well, what did the students think? And several students just said, like, I think he's just insane. Like this, there's no like he seems to just make these leaps to like blaming Jews for everything, and there's no logic to this. Um, but I don't disagree with that at all, and it can be really frustrating to try to actually when you're studying this stuff, are you actually imposing meaning onto this that has no meaning, right? That this is just madness, or it's some kind of lunacy of some kind. Um, and my way, I think, out of that now is to say, well, there's an emotion to this that's actually really important. And one of the reasons why anti-Semitism actually recurs again and again, even at times where there are no Jews. I mean, this is one of the curious things about what a French historian, Leon Poliakov, once called the pure form of anti-Semitism, where you have anti-Semitism that isn't even encumbered by the actual existence of Jewish people. So anti-Semitism in countries that have not had Jewish populations in hundreds of years, if ever. Um, but that kind of emotional satisfaction, I think, is something we really need to pinpoint as like, that's one of the things that racism actually really does. And it does that whether or not there are economic factors or social factors, political factors. Um, I'd like to think that's one of the main contributions this paper makes to how we understand anti-Semitism.